You ask that question around here, and you're going to get told that it's probably one of the best saws Husky ever made. The locals will take a 266 over a 268 or a 272 any day of the week. It was the second pro saw in the 162 chassis, introduced in 1981 and built through 1997. There were some changes along the line, but for the most part, they weren't that major. Very early production, you will find dual ring pistons, but they are very common. I think they were done by somewhere in 82. And this is the piston that you will find for the majority of production in a 266. Early cases as well, you have a slot for the throttle linkage, whereas the later ones have a larger hole. This one, it has a screw for the later style kill switch, as well as a screw for the later style filter mount that actually screwed down, whereas this early one has neither. Also, tank vent on this one has a cotter pin in it, whereas this has a little brass screen. For the most part, though, it's evolutionary change and no real major changes over time. There were some changes earlier on in the porting, and the intake and exhaust port on the very early cylinders is smaller. The port timing changed on the exhaust. The intake not so much, but the actual port itself changed. And looking through the cylinders I have, the major change there with the intake port looks to have occurred probably late 83, early 84. I don't have service bulletins for that time period, but I'm sure it's in them. When we look at these two cylinders, it's not hard to see the change. One significant change is the early saws have a 1/2-inch coarse thread for the clutch, whereas later saws have a 10mm 1.0. And looking at the service bulletins, we see that this occurred in early 1986. Another change you'll find is they went from the HS163 carburetor on the early saws, which they shared with the 61 and 162, to the larger HS224. And then later on, they actually changed that carburetor itself up. So initially, 16th week of 85 for the heated handle saws, and 31st week of 85 for the non-heated saws, we see the 224. And then, in 1987, we added a semi-fixed jet to the high side of the carburetor, so 16th week of 87. And this is also where we see that new filter holder show up. Worth noting that 87 service bulletin, we see it referred to as a 266 XP. There is no service bulletin itself that shows when they changed the designation on the saws. But when you look at stuff through 86, they still had it SG, even though the sticker showed up on the January 1986 IPL. So, well worth noting, none of the major changes reflect the change in designation on the saws.